discipline. Everybody was in the same room, and you had to learn how to focus. You had to learn how to focus your attention. So this is something that we may do that. We may have a Sunday where everybody's going to be together. We may test that. And so all the moms shake their heads and said, we may have to miss that Sunday. So, all right. But we're taking a look again at the sixth test, which proves that the believer is loving God. Again, this is one who's loving the brethren. And we have our text up on the screen here. Again, if a man say, I love God, and hates his brother, he's a liar. But because if you don't love the ones you see, how can we know that you're loving the one that we can't see? Again, love is demonstrated oftentimes by what you do. Love is not a feeling. Love is not something that you fall in and out of. This is the lie that the world tells you, right? These are, in fact, the different types of love. A love that you can fall in and out of might be a physical love, a physical attraction. That Greek word for that is eros. And so you might fall in and out of that. I may not be physically attracted to someone that I was attracted to before. That's not agape love, right? We talked about phileo and storge love already in the introduction. There are different ideas of what we use for that word love. Different ideas, right? But agape love, again, is that love that seeks the benefit of the object. It doesn't seek any return or any investment, any well-being of the subject, but on the object. And so that is something that agape love does. And so we do want to look at the story of Mephibosheth, but before we get to the story of Mephibosheth, we really have to give some background. To truly appreciate the story of Mephibosheth, you kind of have to understand the story of Saul and David, right? So David was this young, red-headed guy who showed up one day in Saul's court. If we learn a little bit about Saul, Saul was the answer when Israel begged God for a king so that they could be like the other nations. So God gave them Saul. And in his description of Saul, we see a word used in the Hebrew that just means good. Saul was a good guy. In fact, he was the goodliest guy, is what we see in 1 Samuel. When Samuel writes about him and describes him to us, he's probably just under 7 feet, traditionally, is what we see. So he towered. He was head and shoulders above everyone else. And so he had the physical frame of a monarch, right? And he was this really good guy. The word good can mean kind. He had, when he was given God's Spirit, he made a lot of good decisions. He had a great start. He thrived. But then when he took what God had reserved for others, the right to sacrifice, did not completely obey God's command to wipe out God's enemies. You can read this story in 1 Samuel chapter 15. God actually rejected Saul from being king. So if you want to read the first few chapters of the book of 1 Samuel, you can see the story of Saul's rise, and then the rest of the book is really about Saul's downfall. This was a good guy. This was the people's choice to be king. God gave the people someone who looked like a king, right? But then we have this other guy. The Bible describes him the man after God's own heart. This was God's choice to be king. So God gave the people two individuals. He gave them man's choice and he gave them his choice. And so David showed up, remember, right there in the middle of 1 Samuel, when there was a problem with a guy named Goliath, all right? David went to visit his younger brothers, and he basically made them all look real bad. He was the little red-headed kid who went out with his sling and his stones and killed God's enemy, killed this 10-foot beast of a man, killed Goliath by sinking a stone into his forehead, and then taking his own sword and cutting off his head. This is what David did. So David is now a new character on the scene, After Saul's sacrificing, when he should have waited for the prophet to come sacrifice, God said, "You've rejected my word, so I've rejected you from being king." He had incomplete obedience and no patience and just totally messed things up. And so God focused his attention from that point on, started dealing with this young redheaded boy, this young man David. And he was then anointed to be king. So for a time, David was the anointed king of Israel, but didn't live in a throne room, didn't have a crown, and didn't actually assume control of the country for another 20 years. So what happened for that 20-year period? Well, we have an artist's description of one of those events. You have Saul, who, after God's Spirit left him, had a troubled spirit. And so the only way Saul could relax was to have somebody play some music for him. So, what a coincidence. Who's the one who was really talented on the musical instrument? Well, it was David. It was the one who was anointed to be the next king. And so he comes in Saul's court, and he plays the harp, he plays the lyra, he calms Saul down. Well, after a while, David takes up, after killing Goliath, he becomes one of the leaders of Saul's army. And so as they went out to fight, Saul started hearing some songs being sung by the people. And he wasn't too crazy about these songs, because what did the song say? Well, Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his 10,000s. So there's a new flavor of the month. And Saul begins to have a jealous spirit. And this jealous spirit can't even stand to see David. And at 2 different times, he takes a spear and tries to kill him for no reason at all. David hasn't done anything wrong. In fact, David, we'll read at multiple places through the passage of in Samuel. Let me see if I can find it. We actually see that that David behaved himself wisely, that David did the right thing. We're going to actually take a look at the relationship between Jonathan and David in a moment. But we see here that David showed skill not only in the throne room with his music, but also on the battlefield. Killing Goliath, used by God to defeat many of God's enemies, Saul became jealous. And it was this jealousy that caused Saul's son, it was a jealousy that Saul's son, Jonathan, didn't understand. Turn, if you would, please, to 1 Samuel chapter 20. Let's read a few of these scriptures. So we're going to jump around in 1 Samuel, but I want you to see down in verse 30 that Saul talks to his son, Jonathan, and the topic is David. Beginning in verse 27, "And it came to pass on the morrow, which was the 2nd day of the month, David's place was empty. Saul said unto Jonathan his son, Wherefore cometh not the son of Jesse to meet, neither yesterday or today? And Jonathan answered Saul, David earnestly asked to leave of me to go to Bethlehem. And he said, Let me go, I pray thee, for our family hath sacrificed in this city, and my brother, he hath commanded me to be there. And now, if I found favor in thine eyes, let me go away, I pray thee, and see my brethren. Then he cometh not unto the king's table." Well, this was a ruse. David was trying to save his life. In fact, Jonathan had warned him earlier in the chapter, it's not a good idea for you to come back around. The next time Dad sees you, he's going to kill you. And so Jonathan didn't understand this jealousy that Saul had of David. Jonathan didn't understand it. We're going to look at Jonathan and David's relationship with each other. But look at Saul's response in verse 30. "Then Saul's anger was kindled against Jonathan, and he said unto him, Thou son of the perverse rebellious woman, do not I know that thou hast chosen the son of Jesse to thine own confusion, and unto the confusion of thy mother's nakedness?" He's very vile. He's very vile, very disrespectful to Jonathan here. And this is he continues on, verse 31. For as long as the son of Jesse liveth upon the ground, thou shalt not be established, nor thy kingdom. Wherefore now send and fetch him unto me, for he shall surely die. Jonathan answered his father and said unto him, Wherefore shall he be slain? What hath he done? And so Saul casts his spear that he has thrown at David a couple of times now. He throws it at Jonathan. Saul cast a javelin at him to smite him, whereby Jonathan knew that it was determined of his father to slay David. So I want us to look at this relationship between David and Jonathan. Jonathan would not let personal jealousy interfere with his friendship. Jonathan was faithful and loyal. In fact, at the very last verse of chapter 17, we see Saul introducing himself to David in verse 58. Saul said unto him, Whose son art thou, young man? And David answered, I am the son of thy servant Jesse the Bethlehemite. 1 Samuel 18, verse 1, And it came to pass when he had made an end of speaking to Saul, that the soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Now this is the greatest possible extent of love that a person can give on their own. This is the greatest example of love outside of agape love. What is the greatest commandment? When Jesus was asked this by the lawyers, what was Jesus' answer? Love the Lord thy God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. This is the greatest extent in the Old Testament of love that's possible. And this is basically the foundation of the law and the prophets. So Jonathan loved David as much as anybody could love someone at this time. And Saul took him that day and would let him go no more into his father's house. This was David. Then Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him. He gave it to David, his garments, even to his sword, his bow, his girdle. This is Jonathan's recognition of something special in David. This is a you deserve princely robes. You deserve the best weapons. You deserve this place of honor. Verse 5, And David went out whithersoever Saul sent him. And again, this is David's response. He behaved himself wisely. Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people and all the sight of the servants. Now this is when this evil spirit began to infest Saul. The spirit of jealousy, but it never affected Jonathan. It never affected Jonathan. In fact, if we skip ahead a couple of chapters, Saul and Jonathan and David continue to be bonded together. Pick it up in verse 12. 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 12. Jonathan said unto David, O Lord God of Israel, when I have sounded my father about tomorrow any time, or the third day, and behold, if there be good toward David, then I send not unto thee and show it to thee. The Lord do so and much more to Jonathan. But if it please my father to do thee evil, then I will show it thee and send thee away, that thou mayest go in peace, and the Lord be with thee as he hath been with my father. And thou shalt not only while yet I live show me the kindness of the Lord, that I die not, but also thou shalt not cut off thy kindness from my house forever. Let's read that again. But also thou shalt not cut off thy kindness from my house forever. No, not when the Lord hath cut off the enemies of David, every one from the face of the earth. So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, Let the Lord even require it at the hand of David's enemies. Jonathan caused David to swear again because he loved him, for he loved him as he loved his own soul. So Jonathan and David made a vow to each other. They said, we're going to take care of each other. And not only going to take care of each other, we're going to take care of each other's descendants. Now, you have to understand what this meant. Back in those days, who was the next king? The king's son, the king's eldest son, right? And as we saw, if you got a chance to go to Pastor's King's class, you saw several times when succession happened that it wasn't smooth. That there were times when siblings were killed. There were times when babies were killed, right? And because if that royal blood is allowed to grow up, it's a threat to the new king. And so Jonathan and David, they were not going to have those problems. They said, no, we're not going to let this lineage of kings, we're not going to let it affect our relationship. We have something that's stronger than that. We have a bond that's stronger. And so now we actually come to the next story, right? Let's take a look at the story of Mephibosheth. So the story of Mephibosheth shows how love can exist and how favor can be shown for one on behalf of another. So Mephibosheth is actually Saul's grandson. He's Jonathan's crippled son. Now, he lived a life of shame and poverty until King David, remembering his covenant with Jonathan, sought him out. But we need to actually see what happened. Okay? I want us to we actually see the story of Mephibosheth coming up a little bit later on. And so if we go to 2 Samuel chapter 9, 2 Samuel chapter 9, we see this story. Now, quite a bit has happened. We leave Saul and Jonathan making a bond. The rest of the book of 1 Samuel is not pretty. Saul tries to kill David multiple times. Saul, instead of fighting against God's enemies, begins to chase David, and David has to start living in caves with his mighty men. And Jonathan, when he tries to do the right thing, when he tries to fight against God's enemies, his dad actually handcuffs him, limits him, says nobody's allowed to eat or drink for the rest of the day, makes some foolish vow. And you need your carbs, you need your energy, right? So if you were to read the rest of the book of 1 Samuel, it's a testament to Saul making bad choices and Jonathan making good choices. But Jonathan has to suffer at the hands of his father. Jonathan sticks up for David. Jonathan continues to act kingly and princely, even though his father doesn't. And Saul has this wicked spirit within him that is driving him to try to kill God's anointed, to try to get him to kill. David, in fact, has a chance twice to take Saul's life, and he won't do it. He won't do it. In fact, his heart is smitten. His conscience bothers him because he cut off the corner of Saul's robe. Remember that account? And he calls to him from the other side of the valley and he says, "Look at the corner of your garment. I got it right here. You were in my hands. I could have killed you." And that's one of the times we see Saul with his wicked spirit, he ebbs and flows. He's nice to David. He's mean to David. He's nice to David. He's mean to David. Tries to kill him. Well, finally, we see Saul comes to an end. We see Saul is mortally wounded in battle against the Philistines. Jonathan is killed, and it just doesn't go well at the end of 1 Samuel. But David, over the next few years, actually has to go through another civil war with Ishbosheth, another one of Saul's kids. But he finally gets established on the throne. His 20 years from when he was anointed back before Goliath till now, chapter 8 of 2 Samuel, David is finally anointed at Hebron. And so this is 4 years or so after he's made this vow with Jonathan. And he's been busy. He's been fighting the Philistines. He's been taking care of the civil war. But finally he remembers his vow. And so David said, verse 1 of chapter 9, Is there yet any that is left in the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? I just want you to think about that statement right there. Saul's family caused David and his family a lot of grief. Kept him from the throne for years. Had him on the run. In fact, there was a time when David actually was hanging out with the Philistines because he couldn't hang out with his own people because he was a fugitive, right? Things went very badly. And so temptation might have been for David to say, "Whew, those guys are finally gone. I don't have to worry about them anymore. I can finally relax. I can live in a palace. I can be a king." But he had made a vow. He had promised. And so he wanted to show kindness. Verse 2, There was at the house of Saul a servant whose name was Ziba. When they called him unto David, the king said unto him, Art thou Ziba? He said, Thy servant is he. And David repeats his question, and Ziba tells the story. Verse 3, Jonathan hath yet a son, which is lame on his feet. And the king said unto him, Where is he? And Ziba said unto the king, Behold, he's in the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, in Lodabar. Now, Lodabar is an interesting word. Lodabar is just a city, and it actually means no pasture. It means no place. So Mephibosheth had gone from being the grandson of the king and living in the palace to living in no place. He was now living in poverty. He was not living as a king. He didn't have a furnished table. He didn't have safety. He didn't live in a place where the army could stand watch. Verse 5, Then King David sent and fetched him out of the house of Machir, the son of Amiel, from Lodabar. Now when Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, was come unto David, he fell on his face and did reverence. And David said, Mephibosheth. And he answered, Behold, thy servant. And David said unto him, Fear not, for I will surely show thee kindness for Jonathan thy father's sake, and will restore thee all the land of Saul thy father, and thou shalt eat bread at my table continually. Mephibosheth's response was one of humility. He bowed himself and said, What is thy servant, that thou shouldest look upon such a dead dog as I am? Mephibosheth was no longer a prince. He was a fallen. He was no longer strong, because in the exit, his nurse dropped him, and he became crippled in both of his legs because of a mistake of his nurse, who was carrying him when he was just a baby, when he was a toddler. Now think of the trauma of that. And then living in that time period. My wife's got a really cool scooter that she can get around the house in. All right? She can get from one room to the other. Before she figured out how to use that scooter, it was hard watching her on crutches. It's hard taking her up and down steps. It's difficult. Can you imagine living a few thousand years ago without that ability? Without all the medical advances that we have today? The ability to manage pain, the ability to ambulate, move around, and to, I mean, she's got some pretty cool She doesn't think so. She thinks this is pretty rotten that's happening to her right now. I feel bad for her. But I'm like, that's a cool scooter. And the kids are always playing on it. Be respectful, right? Your mom's having a hard time. But think of Mephibosheth back then, all right? He recognizes, I've gone from the palace to being a dog. I've gone from being the prince in line to be king one day to living in a place that has no pasture, living in a place that has nothing. It's just in this little place in the end of nowhere. Born a prince, Mephibosheth became lame at age 5 when his nurse dropped him while fleeing news of King Saul and Jonathan's death in battle, injuring his feet. He lived in obscurity and poverty in Lodabar with Machir, fearing reprisal from King David, who was now on the throne. But David, again, remembers his promise. Jonathan, again, had no reason to love David, and David remembered this. In fact, if you remember what we just read in chapter 20, what did Saul say to his son one day? He said, why are you so confused? Why do you love this guy? Every breath that David breathes is a threat to you and your children. And Jonathan loved David anyways. Saul said, you don't get it. You're helping this guy, and you're actually hurting yourself. But Jonathan loved David anyway, and David returned this love. Through the servant Ziba, David actually finds out that Mephibosheth is around and that he can return kindness. So David restores all of Saul's land. He commands that Mephibosheth would always eat at his table like one of his own sons, a significant honor. All right, let's talk a little bit about some symbolism from the Old Testament, right? Mephibosheth saw himself as a dead dog, worthless, highlighting his unworthiness, mirroring humanity's spiritual brokenness before God's grace. But the story exemplifies God's grace through David, showing how he can elevate the undeserving for the sake of his covenant and for the sake of his son Jesus. Despite his disability, despite his poverty, despite his brokenness, he's given a permanent place at the king's table. This symbolizes the believer's permanent acceptance and provision in God's kingdom through Christ. But what I want us to see here is David's willingness to love the unlovable on behalf of another. David didn't even know Mephibosheth existed, right? He didn't even know he existed. But he went through the effort to try to find out, I want to keep my promise. I want to do a kindness on behalf of Jonathan. Who's alive that I can do this? And Ziba helps him find Mephibosheth. David and Mephibosheth didn't have a great relationship. They didn't even know. In fact, Mephibosheth was hiding because he thought David was going to kill him. But David establishes a relationship, someone he can see because of someone he cannot see. David's love for Mephibosheth is because of his love for Jonathan. So he demonstrated, he gave up land that had now become his and gave it back to Mephibosheth and said, I want you to be wealthy. I don't need that wealth. I want you to have that. Sacrificed. He kept alive and around the palace one of the previous king's royal blood. Not a great strategic move. But David did it anyways. Why? Let's go back to our text. Let's go back to 1 John chapter 4. John says it. He says, if a man say, I love God, and hate his brother, he's a liar. For he that loveth not his brother, whom he hath seen, How can he love God whom he hath not seen? David demonstrated a love for the invisible. David demonstrated a love for Jonathan by loving what he could see and what he could take care of. That's what God is asking of us. But he's asking us to do it not with the love that Jonathan had, right? The greatest capacity of human love is to love you the way I love myself. Again, what is Jesus asking? Jesus is asking you and I to love not with our greatest capacity of love, but according to the new commandment, which says, I want you to love the brethren, love one another with the love that I have loved you. We have a greater capacity for love than Jonathan and David did. We have a greater capacity for love. We can love with the agape, self-sacrificing love that Christ loved us with. And how do you demonstrate that you love God? Well, by loving what you can see, by loving each other. Now, a few months ago, remember we talked about hating your brother. No one in here thinks they hate anybody else. But you do. And we talked about that, right? We talked about ways in which we actually hate our brother. We may not say it. We may not want, I want to see somebody get hurt. No, but I avoid you. I show preference. Remember the passage we looked at? Sometimes showing hate is just by not acknowledging someone is there. And so sometimes I walk by and I don't greet. Sometimes I don't give the time of day because I'm like, well, I'm going to ask that person how they are and they're going to tell me. That's going to be a long conversation. Right? I'd rather keep that limited. Now that's a silly excuse of how we do that. Maybe you don't have time for that conversation. I'm not saying that you need to have, that you all need to be here fellowshipping at 12:45, right? That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying you have an opportunity to love each other the way God loved you. When you were without strength, when you were unlovable, when you were his enemy, when you were in sin, when you were the enemy of God, God showed love to you. And you have that opportunity to demonstrate love one another. And this is how you show that you love the invisible, by loving the visible. So we need to do a better job of loving the visible. We need to do a better job of not having a transactional love where I love because of what you can give me back, or I love the way it makes me feel when I love you. But loving for the benefit of the subject. Not the subject, the object. Loving for the benefit of the object of love. The way God did for me. And this is the picture that we see in the Old Testament. And I hope this little picture kind of enables you to have the gratitude for the table that you sit at today. You are the Mephibosheth character. You are the one who was fallen, who was broken, who was in poverty, and God said, I'll restore him. You've been given that love, not because you were worthy of it, but because God decided he wanted to pursue a relationship with you. He wanted fellowship with you. Be grateful of that and take that love and give it to others. That's what God's asking you to do today. Father, we love you. We thank you for